learned that fame is a curse. And he looked at me and he just met my eyes and he was like, Marissa, it is a curse. And sometimes I feel guilty. I can't even sleep thinking about the people that I propelled into this stratosphere. Like I just would, it's the worst. And I thought that was so interesting. And I knew it was true. Like, and you can't, people can say like, oh yeah, but if you wanted it, you get what what you pay for or whatever. And I just don't think that's true. I don't think anyone can fully understand what it's going to be like until it happens. And I don't think that you deserve everything that you get, just because you want it to make your art and put it out there and perform.
This is Storied Account with Jen Jumba. In conversations with writers, something magical happens, and as readers, we begin to know them as human beings and not just the name on the spine of a book. My hope is through these conversations, you learn about their craft and them as a person, and you'll become like me, fiercely loyal, want to read their current book, entire backlist, and any future book or any book they blur. When you see their name, you'll want to support them not only as incredible storytellers, but also the thoughtful individuals you have come to know. Marissa Stapley is the New York Times best-selling author of Lucky, which was the first ever Canadian Reese's Book Club pick, as well as bestsellers Mating for Life, Things to Do When It's Raining, The Last Resort, and The Lightning Bottles, a story of 90s rock and star-crossed love. Many of her novels have been optioned for television. Her journalism has appeared in publications across North America. Marissa has also worked as a sports reporter, cemetery gardener, bartender, destination travel rep, stable hand, and magazine editor. But becoming an author is a dream she has harbored since the age of 7, when she decided she was going to be the next L.M. Montgomery. Yeah, Anne of Green Gables is one of my favorites too. Marissa lives in Toronto with her husband, 2 children, and the best cats in the world, and is happiest while lakeside in Northern Ontario, a good novel or notebook and pen in hand. And I've been, I almost said lucky, fortunate enough to have known Marissa for several years. I've enjoyed getting to know her and treasure her wisdom, encouragement, and friendship. She and her fellow writer, Hannah Mary McKinnon, both visited my library and were the very first writers I was ever in conversation with. So it is only fitting that my very first episode of Storied Account is with Marissa. So Marissa, thank you so much for being here today to talk about Lucky and the Lightning Bottles.
Thank you so much for having me. And I have to apologize in advance for my hoarse-sounding voice. I was cheering the Blue Jays into the World Series last night.
Well, you did well. Cheered hard and look at them. Yeah. It's going to be an epic series with the Blue Jays and the Dodgers for sure. So let's talk a little bit about Lucky. Who is Lucky, and how would you describe her or introduce her to friends and family?
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, Lucky is, she's a con artist with a heart of gold. That's how I always describe her. Mm-hmm. And she is the most tough, resilient character I've ever created. The way I would introduce her, describe her to family and friends is like, hey, this is Lucky, and I met her on a bus. Because I feel like I really did. I was taking a bus to go visit my mom, who wasn't well at the time. And I had the idea for the plot of Lucky. And this has never happened to me before. And I hope it happens again, because it was a wonderful way to kind of get into a book. But I had the plot, and I just I didn't have a character. And I knew the character had to be a criminal, but I wasn't interested in writing about a criminal. So I just was kind of like, I don't know. I'm not interested. And I don't want to hate to love somebody. I'm not into it right now. And then I swear, I feel like Lucky just sat down beside me on the bus and was like, it's your story that you have, that idea about the con artist and the lottery ticket. It's me. My name's Luciana Armstrong. People call me Lucky. Like, I can see it. I know it didn't really happen, but I can see her, like her red hair and her green eyes. And I was working on the Lightning Bottles at the time. And I started texting my agent, and I should go back and find these texts, because I don't delete anything. But I was like, okay,
you archive things.
But it is, yeah. This is what it is. It's Lucky, and this is the book. And I just kept typing and typing to her. And normally, what you do with your agent, like no matter how close you are to your agent, and I'm very close to You wait, you think about it, you write a little, at least an email or some kind of like one pager. And I was just like cold texting as this came into my head, like, this is what I'm doing. And then she replied, she was like, holy shit, sorry.
It's fine.
This is the best idea you've ever had, which she had said about the lightning bottles, by the way, as well. And she was like, you've got to go for it. And I did. And, that was April. And somehow... Lucky was out on submission like less than a year later. I don't know how, because I was also caring for my mom and all of that. And it was just so special. So I really just feel like Lucky kind of just barged into my life, and I'm not done with her yet.
She's an incredible character. She's a character that I absolutely enjoyed reading about. And I think we can say that most of us didn't have the same childhood that Lucky had growing up, right? I think in life, there's like, advantages and disadvantages. Lucky like lived in lots of different places across the country. Just kind of cool, getting to see a big swatch of the country. She has what I would say maybe are unique learning experiences, right? Where she's learning the art of body language and nonverbal communication, like from a very young age. But at the same time, because she's moving and because she's essentially a young kid when she starts, she doesn't really have that same sense of belonging and connection that a lot of us do when we grow up in the same place and we're not leaving, in the middle of the night. So can you talk a little bit about how that influences her behavior?
Yeah, I think, and I will say too, I think that what is important about Lucky is after I created her, I started the novel, and I really wanted Lucky to be liked. And I've spent a lot of time with writer friends and having conversations on panels about, likable characters. And it's so interesting because people seem to sort of hold characters written by female authors to a higher standard. Like, you have to like the character, and if it's not a likable character, then what if it's the writer, and you get accused of all manner of things. Like, if you put infidelity in your book, you suddenly get accused of that. I think Carly Fortune probably most famously had a bit of time about that, and happened to know her and her husband, and they're madly in love, and it's so silly. But I really thought, I need her to be liked, because I don't want this to be like, a book about a criminal where you're, again, like, hating to love the person. I want you to really be rooting for her. And I wrote the entire novel in just the present timeline, and I was like, it's not there. People are going to judge her, and they're going to be like, oh, she's so morally gray, and why is she like this? And I think it was a podcast or something talking about inner child work. And I was listening, and then I was like, oh, it said something like, if you extend the compassion and love to your inner child that you would extend to yourself. And I was like, okay, yes, pinning that for like my own, work, but also for Lucky. Like, people will love her if they meet her when she's little. And I just sat down and I wrote that prologue. I actually read it to my kids, who were a lot littler at the time. I was like, what do you think? And they were like, oh, that's so good. Like the church steps. And then sort of building that childhood. I think it's just such an important part of who Lucky is. And it's been interesting talking to the people involved in the TV production, because even though that stuff there's some, I can't say much, but like, there's not a ton of her childhood, but you see who she is, like just a very brief scene. And that relationship between John and Lucky, and that I've built so carefully in the novel, I think is really the bedrock of a show, even if you're not seeing that much of it. So I think it's just so important, and it's so hard, right? We live in a world where we're so quick to judge people. And I just think that, watching someone like Lucky grow up and understanding why she makes the choices she does, it was just a really important thing for the story. I don't know if I answered your question. I hope I did.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely you did. I mean, that's the great thing about reading a story versus meeting somebody, in real life. First off, is that you don't always have that whole background of who they are. And so how they talk to you or how they treat you go back to how they were growing up. And that can explain a lot. And so Lucky is absolutely a likable character. And you see her as this young kid, who's placed in, a ridiculously unique experience, right? To pull off cons with her father, across the country. And so, yes, that backstory helps to understand why she's doing what she's doing and how she arrives at those decisions, which is a great gift. And I'm so glad that that was captured in television. So talk a little bit about the fact that Apple TV produced Lucky and how special that is.
Oh gosh, it's so, so that's been a long time, of many years in the making as well. So Hello Sunshine optioned the book not too long after it was, I think it was probably before I was able to announce that I was a Reese's pick, but then I knew I was a Reese's pick. I knew that Hello Sunshine wanted to turn it into a show. They worked so hard through a writer's strike. We were still in a pandemic. And I'm really not allowed to say too much, but there are things that are public, like who the cast is. So Anya Taylor-Joy plays Lucky, Annette Bening plays Priscilla, Timothy Olyphant is John, Drew Starkey plays Carrie, Anjani Alice Taylor plays a character named Rand, who's an FBI agent who actually is not in the book, but she's just great. And Clifton Collins Jr. plays a bodyguard named Dutch. And it's so perfect. And I always thought that Anya would be Lucky. I saw her in The Queen's Gambit when I finished writing Lucky. I swear it was like moments later, I came out of my cave and was like, what do I do? Tell me, friends, like, what have you been watching? And my one friend was like, oh, there's this show, The Queen's Gambit. It's about chess. And I was like, I don't think so. And she's like, no, it's like Friday Night Lights when you loved that and you don't like football. And I was like, okay, I'll try it. And she walked on the screen and I was like, yes. Oh my God, this is Lucky. And also I knew that I had gotten the dual timeline with the childhood right, watching this as well. So Hello Sunshine did ask me way at the beginning who I imagined as Lucky. And I was like, there's really only one person and it's Anya Taylor-Joy. And they were like, oh, that's interesting. Okay. And then like maybe a year later, I got a call one summer up at the lake and Lauren Levy Newstadter was like, I got good news for you. We got Anya. And I was like, come on. And I knew then, because Anya attached before anything. And that's very rare. Usually you have to have like a writer, showrunner, script, all this stuff. Annie read the book and this will never not be wonderful to me. She wanted to be involved and she stayed involved through everything. And it's been an incredible experience. And for me, it's been going on for so many years. I've now visited the set. I've read the scripts. It feels like this part of my life for such a long time. And for everybody else, it's really just getting started, which is exciting. Like, all the things that I know, you'll know eventually, like 6 to 9 months from now. So
Well, that's super exciting. So I'm thinking about some of the things in your book about, Lucky, right? And Lucky says, if you want to be a successful con artist like me, you've got to listen to your hunches. Follow those hunches as far as they'll take you. You need to figure out what your instincts are and follow them. The second thing is you have to really believe that you will get to where you want to go. You have to speak, dress, become the person you want to be, pretend you are already all that person. And I just I'm struck. I'm like, wow, she gets imposter syndrome, doesn't she?
Yeah, no, we all do. We really all do. And the more, I think everybody does. Like, I haven't met anyone yet. And, now like attending certain events, like for Hello Sunshine and stuff, you meet a lot of people and you realize everybody does get it. And I think that is partly because what I determined in writing and researching a con artist, and part of the reason that I chose to have a con artist as my criminal in the book is because we have this admiration as a society for con artists in certain instances. Obviously, there are times where like, that's just terrible. But, you watch a movie with a really good con artist and you're like, yes, like this is so fascinating. And I think it might be partly because we're like, wow, that person that person is faking it till they make it and they have no issue. And in the moments that they are conning people, they really do. A successful con artist truly has to believe what they're saying, which I think is also why you come across people who have committed crimes and committed, fraud and cons, and they say they didn't do anything because they believe what they actually start to believe it. And it's a fascinating thing. That as a society, we all sort of participate in. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. And going back to what you said when you introduced her, is that she's a con artist with a heart of gold. And I think that's one of the most interesting parts of Lucky, is that tension that exists in her between, needing to help her dad pull off the con, but at the same time not wanting to hurt people, which kind of almost seems counterintuitive to a con artist. And I think it comes almost to a head when she meets, her friend, or who she perceives to be a friend, and doesn't want to leave.
Yeah.
So it's the first time, I think, that we see in Lucky's life that sense of belonging, where she felt seen and understood by another person. And at that point, I don't think she was really and truly playing a part per se.
No. And that's all very sad, right? Because she asked John not to have to do it. And he was like, no, there's no way. And like, we don't have friends. And then I think one of the saddest parts of the novel is when she's like, but you could just stay. No, you could be happy in this life. And he's like, you don't get it. Like, but you actually do. You cannot love people you're conning. There is a part of you that is disdainful of them. And she, in that moment, could, because John does love her, she could have been like, no, we're going to stay and we're not going to do this. And he probably would have. But she knew he was right, that ultimately, or she allowed him to be right. I mean, she probably could have pushed through it, and she certainly continues to care for Steph throughout her life. But yeah, there's that, and there's a line in the book that every mark is going to leave its mark on her. That does happen too, like you can't, unless you're like a sociopath, like some people in the world who are also con artists are, it gets to you. And it's hard, and it's very isolating.
Yeah, I think that I was going to bring that up, that every mark leaves a mark, and just really taking a minute to kind of stop and think about that, and think, is Lucky really cut out to be a con artist if she finds herself kind of personalizing the person that she's conning, which is always kind of an interesting thing. And I think reading a story about a con artist, that it's against people, and those people have thoughts and feelings that you capture in the book. A lot of times we normally read about a con artist, and it's in an article, that they con this person out of this many dollars, but then you like have to stop and think. And so you explain what that would feel like to the other person who had been conned by somebody who seems just like a normal good guy with a daughter, and wanting to help. And yeah, people aren't always what they seem, I guess.
Yeah, no, and I think, I mean, there were so many articles that I read during the research portion, and I had a Google alert for, different types of, cons and scams. And the one notable one at the time that came up was, there was a woman who believed that she was in an online relationship with Bruno Mars, and he needed like hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep touring because he'd run out of money. And you just are like, oh, like that was a moment too where I realized something about people that then is a very unfortunate thing, which is that there's almost nothing that they won't do for love or the idea of love. And that people exploit that. And that is just, and Lucky never wanted to do that, but John really didn't have a huge issue doing that because he understood. Or he also understood that, you have to get to the root of what each person really wants. And most of the time, that is what they want. It's love and it's money. And so it's just sad to see what people will fall for. And you're just sort of mystified by it. But it's amazing what people will fall for. And it remains true to this day, even when we're, in a world where it's like, you've got to watch out for this and that. And people will still fall for things that are so outlandish, and then they're embarrassed. So sometimes these things sort of go unpunished because they don't want to report it because they're embarrassed.
Yeah, absolutely. Without a doubt, it takes a toll, and to the point of being embarrassed. Absolutely, nobody wants to admit that their emotions, were manipulated for somebody else's gain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's a fascinating book, and the other thing I think about is, one of my favorite characters in the book was Reyes. And she talked about, people deserving, second chances and third chances, and all people do is make mistakes. And if we never forgive, then we'd all be alone. And I really thought about that line for quite a bit, because thinking like, yeah, I think as human beings that we want to think everybody's inherently good and kind, and we lead with our heart. And at the same time, because we do that, sometimes we're prey to other people who will take advantage of that kindness and that generosity.
Yeah, I think too, I mean, we are inherently good and kind. I think that line too actually came from a moment in my life when like a friend of the family who'd had a falling out with the family member who had like brought us to our family, but they had, been estranged for years and then come back together, and we were talking, and she was like, look, people will let you down. Like, this happens, and you gotta, like, she was an older woman, and she's like, I get it now. Like, you can't, you're gonna hold people to this, like, you cannot let me down once, or you're out of my life. You'll be alone. And I think she was speaking from experience too, because she was a woman who didn't have, our family kind of was her family, and she didn't have, people, and came from a different country, and she had learned that the hard way. And I do think about that all the time. And I think about my friendships, and I don't think that my friends are perfect. These are people whose flaws I understand. And sometimes I'm like, there they go. They're doing the thing. But I think part of friendship and love and any kind of relationship is understanding a person's flaws and loving them anyway. And of course, there are things that you can't forgive, and you have to have boundaries, and it's okay to say, like, you know what, you're doing that thing and I don't like that, and you shouldn't, and I'm going to go while you figure that out. But you can't just be like, nope, we're done. Like, I'm cutting you out. And yeah, people who do that, they are alone and they're unhappy. It's a very lonely, challenging way to live.
Yeah, I think that's a good takeaway, not in terms of being a con artist, but in terms of, understanding, that people aren't perfect. I mean, thinking about just ourselves, that we're not perfect. So the fact that we would expect others to be, is not right. And so there's wisdom, I think, in that, about giving people a second chance. Now, if people are continuing to do the same thing and not changing or not cleaning up that behavior or apologizing or taking responsibility, that's a little bit of a different story. But yeah, oftentimes we find ourselves disappointed because our expectations were different, not because that what the person did was inherently bad or with malintent, so to speak.
Yeah, so true. Yeah.
So true. So we'll transition now. I don't know how to create a segue between that being alone, or maybe I can with lightning bottles. So I've read all of your books, and every time I read one, I'm like, oh, now that's my favorite. And then I read another one, I'm like, no, wait, that's my favorite. So I read this one, and I think it's because it is so much about music, and music becomes a character in the lightning bottles. Takes place in the 90s when I was in high school and college, and there are so many memories that are so intricately linked to music. You hear a song and you're like, I know exactly where I was, who I was with, what we were doing, what we were eating, drinking, whatever, when that song comes on. And so the lightning bottles is just this fabulous, I think, love song to the 90s, to music, in particular artists. So, just the opening line, right? Where were you when you found out that rock legend Elijah Hart had disappeared? I mean, hooked from the very beginning. I think there's some, in all of us, a musician who we heard news about, and you'll know exactly where you were when you heard that news. So will you talk a little bit about Elijah and Jane?
Yeah. So, yes. And I mean, that moment, I was in the car with my mom when I found out Kurt Cobain had died, and I can still hear Alan Cross, as a Canadian DJ's voice, saying it, and just being like, I really hate to be the one to have to say this, right? And you're just like, oh no. And we knew that he wasn't doing well, and it was it was really tough. And so I think that sort of born from that experience, that's kind of how Jane and Elijah were born, because you think about how you can hear the news that someone died and know exactly where you were. And like, you didn't know that person. Like, this was not a person that you knew who was in your life. And yet it can be defining. And there was so much in the 90s. I know pretty much, every era certainly has its casualties, but it really does feel like that alternative era was just like the body count, it was very, very high, and there was such tragedy and, death by misadventure and suicide, and it was a lot. And I started to think, what if every story starts with a what if? Like, what if it wasn't that way? Like, what if I could like create something else where there was like an escape hatch, and like, what if? So then I created this rock star couple who, at first I was thinking Kurt and Courtney in a way, but I always knew that their relationship was just slightly too volatile and complicated. And Kurt Cobain's struggles were very difficult to write about. Like, I did a lot of research, and you just read about it and you're like, oh, but it would have just been so easy. It's like he's like purposely blindfolded, right? And if he had lived, he'd be like, oh man, I was really kind of down in the mud puddle, and actually there was like a pool right beside me. I didn't have to be doing that. So I started also reading about Jeff Buckley, and I was a huge fan of Sinead O'Connor, and she actually died while I was writing the book, which was heartbreaking. And just started to try to create these characters who I could somehow rewrite their story. And I don't want to give too much away, but, we're usually heading toward some kind of redemption in my novels. So just to make it dark and difficult, but like they're heading somewhere good.
Yeah. And I think it's also interesting too that, Elijah and Jane were a duo, together writing, and one half of the duo disappears, and the impact that it has on that, on Jane, who's remaining, and how she ends up, becoming, friends, I guess you would say, with Hen next door. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic, about next door neighbors?
Yeah. So I think, again, like coming from a place where I was thinking about my fandom as a teenager, and how I felt that I knew people. They felt like characters, though they didn't, they weren't almost real. And there is, Hen lives next door to Jane in the countryside where she's trying to hide out. She's a teenage super fan of the Lightning Bottles, which makes sense because they were so stratospherically famous. And, and Hen is really connected to Elijah in particular, even though he doesn't know her. And the journey that they go on together is definitely about finding Elijah, and it's about going back in time and figuring out what happened between Jane and Elijah to cause them to be where they are at the start of the book. But there's, an important moment where Jane says to Hen, like, I'm a human being, ultimately, and I'm not just a star. But I feel like Hen, in just who she is, and she doesn't really have to say it, but she's like, I am a human being too. Like, we are also human beings. And so they get this rare opportunity to prove that to each other. And so the book is just as much about their relationship as it is about Jane and Elijah's relationship. And I think we've all had that relationship, that one-sided relationship with someone. And it's just so fertile for stories. It's so heartbreaking, but I loved putting them together. And I didn't actually realize how many similarities they would have. That just all started to happen, right? And I'm sure that could happen,
Yeah, I mean, I think that was it, because Hen's about the same age that Jane was when she started this, I'm going to be a musician and I want to write songs, and ends up meeting Elijah, online. And, Hen is of roughly that same age, where everything is so impressionable at that age, when you're a teen, and the importance, I guess, of, wanting to fit in and wanting to find your gift and your passion. And in Hen's case, it was, music. Same with Jane. And the other thing I found interesting, you talked a little bit about how they said, I'm just a human being. That some of the conflict that arises with Elijah and Jane is them being almost chameleons. They have a persona of who they are as these amazing musicians that reach incredible success very quickly, and are known and can't go anywhere because everybody recognizes them. And then they play to the crowd depending on who they're with as to whether or not they're this persona or their authentic selves.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting too. Like, I was thinking, just this week, like Sabrina Carpenter on Saturday Night Live, and people get all like heated up about like a, brazen pop star. And I'm like, first of all, whatever. Like, did we not go through this with like Madonna and Like a Virgin? Like, everybody clutched their pearls, and it's annoying, especially in a world where you could access anything on the internet. I'm like, okay, really? Like, can we just all calm down? But like, also how people don't see that these people are performing. Like, she's not giving herself. Can you imagine getting up and being like, this is who I really am? Like, you're performing. You have to do that to protect yourself. So, I just think it's interesting how people just don't get it over and over. But it would also be so weird to do that. And I think with Jane and Elijah too, they are fairly real and raw. She especially. So she sort of guards herself, whereas he can put on this persona, but I think he ultimately becomes very bothered by the fact that he is not that interested in himself. Like, some people become stars and they're just like narcissists. They're like, yes, of course, it's all about me. It should have always been about me all along. And he's like, I don't find myself that interesting. And now I'm in rooms where I'm the most interesting person in the room. And that's just so depressing. I do think that's where he's similar to Kurt Cobain. I think he found that too, right? He was like, seriously? Like, he wanted to be famous and all of that, but it wasn't because of this like narcissistic impulse. It was different. I'm not 100% sure I can get to the root of why, but probably to do with making art and recognition and all of that. But then he suddenly became so interesting, and he was like, oh, this is not that interesting. / he may have been playing a role that he didn't exactly feel comfortable in. So then he's like, oh, people think that this is so interesting and it's not even really me. Like, it just does your head in so many ways. And there's just, yeah. So, and I think if there's, I learned many things researching, and all of the people I spoke to, and, people in the music industry and the books that I read. And I spoke to someone once, and he used to be an A&R rep and was responsible for discovering some pretty big bands. And I was like, I think I learned that fame is a curse. And he looked at me and he just met my eyes and he was like, Marissa, it is a curse. And sometimes I feel guilty. I can't even sleep thinking about the people that I propelled into this stratosphere. Like, it's the worst. And I thought that was so interesting. And I knew it was true. Like, and people can say like, oh yeah, but if you want it, you get what what you pay for or whatever. And I just don't think that's true. I don't think anyone can fully understand what it's going to be like until it happens. And I don't think that you deserve everything that you get, just because you want it to make your art and put it out there and perform.
So funny you mentioned that, because that was the next line I was going to bring up with Helen, talking and saying fame is a curse. It's the price that must be paid for doing something we love so much, but still sometimes that price feels a little too high. And you set out to do something that you love, and then it kind of explodes, and you kind of, I want to say, don't have control over that per se. But just thinking about how your world changes upside down, where like the things you used to be able to do, you can't do. Like, a normal person can go to the grocery store, but I mean, if you're messy and you go to the grocery store, in Florida, people know who you are, pushing the cart through, right? And just how disruptive that has to be. And if you're constantly performing, at what point does that line kind of blur into who you really are? And you start believing that the person that you're projecting, like that's who you are versus who you were when you were just kicking around lyrics and music when you first started.
Yeah, I think it is, Helen is right. And I put that line in there because of what I knew. And I felt like Helen, who, by the way, is from my debut novel, Mating for Life. She's a cameo. I think the price is too high. And I think of somebody like Taylor Swift, and she's doing a really good job, maintaining a really tight hold on the reins of her narrative. And I'm in awe of her. And I feel sad that she has to do that because it's not fair, but she does it so well. But I don't think that she understands the price, because I actually thought, going on a little Taylor Swift segue, we would talk a lot about when she got together with Travis, like, were they going to get married and have kids? And my husband would be like, well, of course that's what she's going to do. And I was like, well, I don't think so, because if I were her, I would not do that, because, you can't have kids and then in that world, like, that's going to be so hard. And so now I see that is, and of course, like, it makes sense. That's what she really wants. And I'm like, oh no, but the price, that's going to be the price, right? Like, you put these people out there, like, it's one thing to be maintaining hold and control of your own narrative. Then you've got your heart walking around outside of your body. And like, I would not recommend it. Like, I don't, and I hope, it's going to hurt. It's going to be hard, because people are really tricky about fame and kids of famous people. So, I mean, look, they've whoever these kids are, they're going to have, they're ahead of other people because she's so good at maintaining, that protection. But, it's such a high price, and I don't know if it's worth it. And I actually love being a successful author, because, like, I've been recognized maybe 3 times, and it's so fun. And like, it's also like, that's like, 3 times in my whole life that will, and it was one person like actually worked at Simon & Schuster. So, it's just so much easier, right? You don't have to walk around. You don't have to feel protective of your family and your stories.
Yeah. I mean, I was about to ask you that about, you're, an incredible writer, best-selling, Reese pick, Lucky was optioned for Apple TV by Hello Sunshine. So, I mean, some bragging rights, and reward for your accomplishment. But, you say that you're still able to kind of go out and live your life, and people aren't like fangirling.
No, I mean, only like when you go to events and then people know you're there. I think it's kind of like, normally I'm just like this, right? And then my headshot looks very different. Full makeup. Right. I do find it gratifying when people are like, oh, I recognize you from your headshot. I'm like, oh, good. Okay. Yeah, it's just so different. I mean, it's tricky though, because you're putting so much of yourself into your work. So you're sort of exposing yourself that way, but it's just so much easier. Yeah, you couldn't pay me, and I would just never, ever want to be actually famous. And I think it scares me the way even my kids will be like, oh yeah, but it would be so great to be like, TikTok famous or this. And I'm like, no, it's just so dangerous, right? And it's so fleeting in most cases too.
And the flip side, I think, not that this would ever happen to you because you have a heart of gold, is that we are quick to build people up and then take great pleasure in seeing them fall. And I think, why set yourself up for that? I mean, we all are human. We're not perfect, but there's something, and I can never remember the phrase or say it correctly, Schadenfreude, where where we take pleasure in watching somebody else be uncomfortable. And there is that. And I can remember watching like MTV Cribs back in the day. And like, oh my God, these people have like swimming pools and basketball courts and movie theaters in their home. And I was like, well, duh, Jen, they can't go out to like the local park down the street and shoot hoops if they want to.
Yeah.
They can't go see a movie like with their friends like I do. So I understand that wanting to maintain that sense of privacy as much as you can. So, as we wrap up, because I know you're tight on a deadline, is there anything I haven't asked that you would like readers to know?
I think that there was a review of the lightning bottles where the reviewer was sort of like, well, they didn't feel that I had handled, the addiction piece, with something like with a light hand. And it really bothered me because I did so much research. I have, friends and family who've struggled with addiction and mental health issues. And I was also trying to write something like from the get-go where I was like, but what if it could just be different? What if there was a different path? And I think often, the only way out of addiction is just complete abandonment, like just getting completely out of where you are. And also, sadly, so many of the people I read, memoirs of people who were, not so many, every single memoir I read written by an addict during my research, everybody, including Matthew Perry, which I did not see coming, everybody died. And I was just like, I know it's serious. I get it. But like, I'm creating an escape hatch because this is also my world that I created. So yeah, I do want, readers to understand that I get it. I know how hard it is. And I know you can't just kind of wave your magic wand. But I wonder too, as someone who's struggled with these sorts of things, if reading something with an outcome like this is just helpful. And that's where I came from. I wasn't like, oh, I don't know if I really have time to research addiction, so I'll just kind of like gloss over it, And I don't really think I did. I mean, I get that it's probably a million times darker than I portrayed it, but yeah, I also want this to be a balm. All of my books, like for the soul. So yeah, I just want readers to realize that.
I think, yeah, you did a wonderful job of capturing that. You and I have had some truly hard conversations over the years, and you have always been a balm. So there's no reason why that is not apparent in this book either. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So Storied End, final 5 questions.
Okay.
Lucky references some superstitions. Is there anything that you are superstitious about?
Well, yeah, I mean, like last night, I think I broke the curse of the Blue Jays with like a knife falling out of my Rice Krispies. Oh my gosh, we were so superstitious last night about everything. Like my kids didn't want me to record the last out. They're like, what if it's a home run? It's going to be your fault. So yeah, with sports, it's funny how we think we did this, right? It somehow has something to do with us. I'm superstitious about something that I have been superstitious about since I wrote Mating for Life. And there's a scene where Helen actually, explains about like the evil eye too, and how you, when you're feeling jealous of someone or resentful, can like accidentally give them the evil eye. And I'm super superstitious about that because of the more successful you are, the more like vulnerable you are. So I do take steps to protect myself from that. And then I just really try not to be superstitious because a lot of the rest of my superstitions are like just my anxious thoughts manifesting themselves. And like, if I think this, it will happen, which is not real. Like I remember once being in a therapy session, like just parenting check-in, and the therapist was like, just because something can happen doesn't mean it will happen. And I was like, whoa, okay. So that's my like anti-superstition thing.
There you go. What would you do if you won the lottery and did cash in the winning ticket?
And could. What would I do? I would get a horse, I think. I want a horse. I've been thinking about that a lot lately because we didn't talk about Christmas at the Ranch, but I do have a book with horses in it. And then, yeah, I mean, I would just do, as many experiences as I could with my family and friends. And I think, too, you just have to look at how you can be of service in the world. I already do feel like a very lucky person, so...
You are pretty lucky, and I think with your books, you do a service, whether it's us learning from somebody else's life experience, and I think makes us more empathetic to understanding that everybody's fighting something. We might not always know what it is. So what's it like to write song lyrics? Because you wrote song lyrics in lightning bottles.
Yes. Well, I actually took those. I read all through my journals from my teenage years, and there was a lot of poetry in there. And I was like, oh, wow, I wrote a lot of poetry. And it was very tortured. And so I thought, well, this is perfect because I don't think I could have created those lyrics in particular without the basis coming from, my teenage self. I just thought it was really fun. I do feel like as much as I'm like, I would never want to be famous. I actually had a band in high school. We didn't have any instruments or talent, but like we had like a name, and I wrote the liner notes, and like I wrote song lyrics. And I think it was really fun to do that. And I've been told by a few people, like, these are pretty good. You could use these, but I don't know how to play music, so I can't really use them until somebody comes along and turns it into something. So.
Well, that's what happened with Elton John and Bernie. I'm just saying, one had the music, one had the lyrics, so it's out there. Final question: what song would you always include on a road trip playlist?
Goodness, I have like a 7-hour road trip playlist, but I think, and this is my husband's favorite song, and it kind of has certain meaning for us. So I think like Ramble On by Led Zeppelin is kind of a must, but also Ventura Highway by America. You kind of need that too. And then, so many. We Float by PJ Harvey for the 90s. It's kind of like driving along. And,
Oh, good. I would love to do a 7-hour road trip. You're in charge of the music and I'll be in charge of driving.
Yeah.
So a huge thank you to all of you listening, and an incredibly huge thank you to Marissa Stapley for joining us today. I hope you've been delighted to get to know Marissa and her books, and we'll go out and read every single thing she's ever written. Guarantee you will not be disappointed, and your heart will be full at the end. To see who is next, visit storiedaccount.com. It's a Storied Account with Jen Jumba.